"Enough," he said. "Suppose now you come with me." He reached for the tangle gun, flipped the little switch on its side to "melt," and shot a stream of watery fluid over our legs, keeping the blaster trained on us all the while. Our legs were free. "You may get up now," he said, slowly, without trying to make trouble. Val and I helped each other to our feet as best we could, considering our arms were still tightly bound against the sides of our oxysuits. "Walk," the stranger said, waving the tangle gun to indicate the direction. "I'll be right behind you." He holstered the tangle gun. I glimpsed the bulk of an outboard atomic rigging behind him, strapped to the back of the wheelchair. He fingered a knob on the arm of the chair, and the two exhaust ducts behind the wheel housings flamed for a moment, and the chair began to roll. Obediently, we started walking. You don't argue with a blaster, even if the man pointing it is in a wheelchair. "What's going on, Ron?" Val asked in a low voice as we walked. Behind us, the wheelchair hissed steadily. "I don't quite know, Val. I've never seen this guy before, and I thought I knew everyone at the Dome." "Quiet up there," our captor called, and we stopped talking. We trudged along together, with him following behind. I could hear the crunch, crunch of the wheelchair as its wheels chewed into the sand. I wondered where we were going and why. I wondered why we had ever left Earth. The answer to that came to me quick enough. We had to. Earth needed the radioactives, and the only way to get them was to get out and look. The great atomic wars of the late 20th century had used up much of the supply, but the amount used to blow up half the great cities of the world hardly compared with the amount we needed to put them back together again. In 3 centuries, the shattered world had been completely rebuilt. The wreckage of New York and Shanghai and London and all the other ruined cities had been hidden by a shining new world of gleaming towers and flying roadways. We had profited by our grandparents' mistakes. They had used their atomics to make bombs. We used ours for fuel. It was an atomic world. Everything, power drills, printing presses, typewriters, can openers, ocean liners, powered by the inexhaustible energy of the dividing atom. But though the energy is inexhaustible, the supply of nuclei isn't. After 3 centuries of heavy consumption, the supply failed. The mighty machine that was Earth's industry had started to slow down. And that started the chain of events that led Val and me to end up as a madman's prisoners on Mars. With every source of uranium mined dry on Earth, we had tried other possibilities. All sorts of schemes came forth. Project Sea Dredge was trying to get uranium from the oceans. In 40 or 50 years, they'd get some results. We hoped. But there wasn't 40 or 50 years worth of raw stuff to tide us over until then. In a decade or so, our power would be just about gone. I could picture the sort of dog-eat-dog world we'd revert back to. Millions of starving, freezing humans, tooth and clawing it in the useless shell of a great atomic civilization. So, Mars. There's not much uranium on Mars, and it's not easy to find or any cinch to mine. But what little there is helps. It's a stopgap effort, just to keep things moving until Project Sea Dredge starts functioning. Enter the Geig Corps. Volunteers out on the face of Mars combing for its uranium deposits. And here we are, I thought. After we walked on a while, a dome became visible up ahead. It slid up over the crest of a hill, set back between 2 hummocks on the desert, just out of the way enough to escape observation. For a puzzled moment, I thought it was our dome, the settlement where all of Uranko's Geig Corps were located. But another look told me that this was actually quite near us and fairly small. A one-man dome, of all things. "Welcome to my home," he said. "The name is Gregory Ledman." He herded us off to one side of the airlock, uttered a few words keyed to his voice, and motioned us inside when the door slid up. When we were inside, he reached up clumsily, holding the blaster, and unscrewed the ancient spacesuit fishbowl. His face was a bitter, dried-up mask. He was a man who hated. The place was spartanly furnished. No chairs, no tape player, no decoration of any sort. Hard bulkhead walls, rivet-studded, glared back at us. He had an automatic chef, a bed, and a writing desk, and no other furniture. Suddenly he drew the tangle gun and sprayed our legs again. We toppled heavily to the floor. I looked up angrily. "I imagine you want to know the whole story," he said. "The others did, too." Valerie looked at me anxiously. Her pretty face was a dead white behind her oxy mask. "What others?" "I never bothered to find out their names," Ledman said casually. "They were other Geigs I caught unawares, like you, out on the desert. That's the only sport I have left, Geig hunting. Look out there." He gestured through the translucent skin of the dome, and I felt sick. There was a little heap of bones lying there, looking oddly bright against the redness of the sands. They were the dried, parched skeletons of Earthmen. Bits of cloth and plastic, once oxymasks and suits, still clung to them. Suddenly I remembered. There had been a pattern there all the time. We didn't much talk about it. We chalked it off as occupational hazards. There had been a pattern of disappearances on the desert. I could think of 6, 8 names now. None of them had been particularly close friends. You don't get time to make close friends out here. But we'd vowed it wouldn't happen to us. It had. "You've been hunting Geigs?" I asked. "Why? What have they ever done to you?" He smiled as calmly as if I'd just praised his housekeeping. "Because I hate you," he said blandly. "I intend to wipe every last one of you out, one by one." I stared at him. I'd never seen a man like this before. I thought all his kind had died at the time of the atomic wars. I heard Val sob. "He's a madman." "No," Ledman said evenly. "I'm quite sane, believe me. But I'm determined to drive the Geigs and Uranco off Mars. Eventually I'll scare you all away." "Just pick us off in the desert?" "Exactly," replied Ledman. "And I have no fears of an armed attack. This place is well fortified. I've devoted years to building it. And I'm back against those hills. They couldn't pry me out." He let his pale hand run up to his gnarled hair. "I've devoted years to this. Ever since I landed here on Mars." "What are you going to do with us?" Val finally asked after a long silence. He didn't smile this time. "Kill you," he told her. "Not your husband. I want him as an envoy to go back and tell the others to clear off." He rocked back and forth in his wheelchair, toying with the gleaming, deadly blaster in his hand. We stared in horror. It was a nightmare, sitting there placidly rocking back and forth. A nightmare. I found myself fervently wishing I was back out there on the infinitely safer desert. "Do I shock you?" he asked. "I shouldn't. Not when you see my motives." "We don't see them," I snapped. "Well, let me show you. You're on Mars hunting uranium, right? To mine and ship the radioactives back to Earth to keep the atomic engines going, right?" I nodded over at our Geiger counters. We volunteered to come to Mars," Val said irrelevantly. "Ah, 2 young heroes," Ledman said acidly. "How sad. I could almost feel sorry for you." Almost. "Just what is it you're after?" I said, stalling. "Atomics cost me my legs," he said. "You remember the Sadlerville blast?" he asked. "Of course. And I did, too. I'd never forget it. No one would. How could I forget that great accident, killing hundreds, injuring thousands more, sterilizing 40 miles of Mississippi land, when the Sadlerville pile went up?" "I was there on business at the time," Ledman said. "I represented Ledman Atomics. I was there to sign a new contract for my company. You know who I am now?" I nodded. "I was fairly well shielded when it happened. I never got the contract, but I got a good dose of radiation instead. Not enough to kill me," he said. "Just enough to necessitate the removal of—" he indicated the empty space at his thighs. "So I got off lightly." He gestured at the wheelchair blanket. I still didn't understand. "But why kill us Geigs? We had nothing to do with it." "You're just in this by accident," he said. "You see, after the explosion and the amputation, my fellow members on the board of Ledman Atomics decided that a semi-basket case like myself was a poor risk as head of the board, and they took my company away. All quite legal, I assure you. They left me almost a pauper." Then he snapped the punchline at me. "They renamed Ledman Atomics. Who did you say you worked for?" I began. Uran. Don't bother.